Hey everyone. What I want to do here is talk about the assigned readings this week that relate to Huntington's Clash of Civilizations idea, or theory, we would have to say. And the point is to help you kind of read the technical, the quantitative analysis articles, but also to put this in the context of research methods and, how we as political scientists evaluate the ideas that people come up with and put them to the test. And so kind of the idea is there are certainly parts of the quantitative articles that are just going to be a mystery, right? Because you haven't got that stuff right. You're going to get that in the research methods course. But I want you to understand what they're trying to do, and if you don't understand the technical aspects of the statistical analysis, what I want you to get an idea of is what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve with that statistical analysis. And that gives you an idea of how we think about things and how this whole science thing works. Okay, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. 1993, Samuel Huntington wrote this article in Foreign Affairs, Clash of Civilizations, question mark, and he came up with this idea, or he promoted this idea, that after the Cold War, and remember, it's 1993, the Cold War is just over, and in the 90s, if you were an IR person, which I was actually in graduate school at this point, and you kind of were in this post-Cold War world, and you're like, well, what's going on now? What's going to happen? So you, you know, this was an idea, and he said, look, uh, the world is broken into 8 civilizations, and he listed them, and he said that in the future, without a Cold War, without a bipolar thing going on in the world, that in the future conflict is going to be across civilizations. Differences between in civilizations are going to make people, fight one another, and he predicted that there would be more war between nations from different civilizations, right? So that split difference is the cause of fighting, and that wars located on the fault lines were likely to be concentrated along the fault lines. We talked about the tectonic plates, and just like earthquakes occur where they rub against one another, so wars were going to occur. And that was his main prediction. Now, by the way, he wrote a book. This article was very well received. He wrote a book, same name, same title, took the question mark off, didn't add a lot to the theory, but went into a lot of historical analysis. And one criticism you could have, or I have, of this approach is that, you know, it's it's qualitative research, and you need to do this, and that's okay. It's okay to build an idea, but to a certain extent, it's an example of confirming evidence of a confirmation bias, that you bring up all the examples that fit your case because you're selecting, right? And so you amass this book that becomes, by the time someone's done reading it, they have all these examples, and they're, oh wow, this is great. So but that's kind of what you do at the beginning. So not to fault him for doing that, but to say that, that's a problem. And that's why we are a science. We're a program. We're going to go on and we're going to look at it a little bit more. And, we're not done with that book. So let's talk about how people have looked at it. Russett, O'Neal, and Cox do this. There's a few examples of people that did it. Not all of them are given here, but they look at it and they say, all right, well, is this a clash of civilizations, or is this simply the other ideas we've had going on? And basically, this paper does two things that are important. One is it tests the hypotheses that Huntington comes up with, and it's a good thing he came up with testable hypotheses. That's what we want. We need to have that from a theory, or else we can't do anything with it. And they're going to say, all right, are these wars occurring the way Huntington says? and we're going to test it against a data set of all nations, not just selected historical examples. We're going to look at it across all the nations we can get data for. And then they also bring in rival hypotheses in the form of realism and liberalism. And realists would say that, hey, things that affect war, the likelihood of war between two nations, one is contiguity. You fight with your neighbors, you fight with the people you can reach. Power attenuates over distance. Very few nations can project power. So, in any given year, the fact that Peru and Zimbabwe don't go to war is perhaps understandable, but just by lack of contiguity. So, and they also talk about alliances and the relative power of nations has an impact. So these are the realist ideas. Then liberalism has ideas that democracy, if if two nations are democratic, they won't fight one another. And so we're going to, that's the democratic peace theory, which you'll read a lot about. Also, the idea if they trade a lot, they're not less likely to fight. And this is economic liberalism, different type of liberalism. But these are other ideas. And so they're going to put those in as rivals and sort of control variables, right? To see if other things can explain the occurrence or non-occurrence of war better than Huntington's thing. And this is how we roll, basically. So it's to my mind, a very good example of how people following a positivist approach, which some people are critical of positivism, but how we go about testing ideas. Okay, when you read a paper like this, it always starts out, they'll introduce what's going on, they'll talk about the case, they'll talk about the theory involved, right? And so you have like an intro piece with lots of references to other people. This paper also builds on other people, and I think it demonstrates something that is very important, this idea of accumulation. We build on the work of other people, and very often we find it useful. And so for defining and identifying civilizations in a data set, right, how do you do that? And they build on the work of Henderson and Gurr, right? And so we see that these are, they look out there and they say, hey, these guys have done it, so let's use their stuff. Their method of analysis, this concept of dyads, is very important. In order to, if you're going to talk about something creating war, increasing the likelihood of war, well, you have to have cases where there isn't war. And those are hard to find. Well, actually, they're very easy to find in the sense that Peru and Zimbabwe have every year, we know, not gone to war. And the thing is, they're hard to notice. They don't draw attention. And so generally what you do is a very common thing in IR is you say, look, we have data sets of war occurring. Okay, I have this data set that has war occurring. And then in each of these years, we find how many countries there are. And, it's a finite set, 170, 80, the number changes, but it's not a big number. And in each year, you just say, all right, we're going to create dyads. And we're going to say, you pair up each nation with every other nation, basically. And so it's essentially a square of the number of nations that you have. So it turns 170 or 80 turns into tens of that, over 10,000 pretty quick. And so we get, and each year you have, all right, this is that dyad for this year. And then you say, all right, who went to war? And so you code a 1 if they went to war or had a militarized dispute, which is a definition. It includes lower levels of hostility, right? It's not an all-out war. It's a weaker definition of it, but you've done some kind of you've taken some kind of military action against somebody. And you put a 1 in all the dyads that had a war and then a 0 everywhere else. And so now you've got the complete set and you have variation in your dependent variable, very important thing. Also, they talk about how they specify and operationalize the independent variables. We'll talk about that a little bit more here. Okay, the independent variables split. This is the big one. And it's coded 1 if the nations in the dyad are from different civilizations. This is Huntington's variable. Difference is supposed to cause war. So if a dyad has, if the two states in a dyad are from different civilizations, we code it 1. If they're from the same civilization, we code it 0. Boom. Realist variables. We have contiguity. If two nations are contiguous, gets a 1. They have the capabilities ratio, which comes from the correlates of war, the cow. There's a data set, correlates of war, that was put together starting in the 70s. It has every nation. It has what realists have thought are the important military capabilities that affect balance of power decisions. And the general balance of power idea is if there's an imbalance of power, if one nation's much stronger than the other one, they're more likely to go to war. If they tend to be even, they won't. And then ally. If nations are in an alliance or have a pact, they're thought to not go to war, presumably because they have some other big bad they're dealing with, right? And so their alliance makes them less likely to fight one another. So those are the realist variables. The liberal variables are democracy and dependence. And democracy can be measured. If you have a dyad, you say, all right, what's the, and Polity 3 is a database that has a scoring of democracy in a nation. And you go in Dem L, it's the score of the least democratic nation in the dyad, right? And in Dem H, it's the score of the highest one. And the idea is, if the score of the highest one is low, then we're dealing with a lower level of democracy, and that tells you something. If, on the other hand, we have the lower score of Dem L, tells you that, hey, what are they, there's this idea, maybe it's the lower score that drives the boat. And if Dem L is high, then we know that both states are democracies, right? Does that kind of make sense? And so when that's high, we know that, all right, the lowest democratic state's pretty high, so we shouldn't see fighting here. Okay, just go with it. Then there's dependency. Trade with the other member of the dyad as a percentage of the GDP, and it takes the lower of the two for the least dependent one. And that gives us a measure of, hey, as a portion of their democracy, how important is the trade? How big is the trade between these two nations? And these are all the different variables that are going to be in there. And when you read a paper, you always, you have to get the theory, get the hypotheses, then you have to see, all right, what are the variables? How are they measuring them? They generally describe how they measure each variable. Sometimes it's a bit opaque because you've probably never heard of polity, you probably never heard of cow, but everyone else has. And so when they say we're using these polity scores, some people, if you're new to it, it's like, I have no idea what they're doing. It's like, well, no, we know exactly what they're doing. You just have to look up polity and what they're doing. So this is what makes this harder when you're starting out. Okay, you've seen this table before in the regression basics presentation, and but to revisit it now, it makes more sense. Hopefully, the dependent variable is the occurrence of a militarized dispute, and we get that from the context of what we're reading. And then we've already defined all the variables, so now we know what they mean. And each column represents a different model. And in the first column, we have the simplest one. Our authors put up contiguity versus the split between the civilizations of the nations. And what we see here is that for split, we have 0.20. That's the coefficient. Really hard to interpret a logistic coefficient in and of itself. But we do see the sign. It's positive. So a split, this variable is 1 if there's a split between if there's two different civilizations. So there is a positive relationship there. Okay, so it's in the predicted direction of the theory. However, it's very small. Now, how do I know it's small? Because I don't know what 0.2 is. Well, there are no asterisks, right? And basically, you compare the coefficient to the standard error, which is the number in parentheses, and the bigger the ratio of the two, the more likely it is to be. That's a rule of thumb. And so, but more importantly, the authors, they give us asterisks, and I always say it's an asterisk hunt. I don't want you telling other professors I've told you that, okay? But that's really what you do, okay? And we see it's not significant. What we do see is contiguity. Wow, 3.52, much bigger than the standard error, and it just happens to be the same. They're not always the same in these things, but as you'll see in other columns, but much bigger. Positive, when you're contiguous, you're more likely to go to war. And again, duh. But we see 3 asterisks, so it's highly significant. So we find that when we account for contiguity, the difference of civilizations doesn't have an impact. And the constant, I have no idea what the constant does in this context when it's when everything else is 0. What's the likelihood? By the way, you see our N down there, that there's 363,000 dyads in this data set. So N is always the number of observations, right? Okay, so we go across, again, each column tells you a different model, a different number of variables. Column 2 puts in the realist variables of whether a nation is an ally. And hey, guess what? If you are an ally, it does make it less likely for you to fight. Why do I know less? Because there's a negative sign there, right? And ally was 1 if you're an ally, because you always have to know how they're coding it, right? So you do have to read the paper and get that. So it's 1 if you're an ally, if the 2 nations in the dyad are an ally, that is. And the sign is negative. Okay, so that means that when you're having an alliance, you're less likely to have a militarized dispute. I keep saying war, but technically militarized dispute. Well, cool. And there's 3 asterisks. It's significant. And we bring in cap ratios and negative impact when when we have that. And it's significant, not as significant, but still, 2 asterisks are good. That's good. So we see the realist model is explaining stuff pretty well. Moving into the next column 3, we've got the liberal, right? So we've still got split and contiguity in there, right? They're in every model. And we are now looking at what's the effect of democracy and dependence. We see that democracy does have a negative impact, right? Meaning that if you're, DemL, the higher the democracy rating of the lowest one, which means they're both democracies. As you get up there, as it goes up, we see a decrease. Not a huge one, but just comparing ratios to coefficients to each other, but negative and with and significant. And then we also see that dependency, there's a negative relationship, but it's not significant. So, but there is something going on there. And still, notice when we put these variables in, notice the sign of the split, top of the column, the first line, is now negative. By bringing in these liberal variables, we're now seeing that Huntington's, not only is Huntington's key variable, independent variable, not significant, it is no longer in the predicted direction. The last column is they put it all together. The realist stuff, the liberal stuff, and Huntington, right? And we find that contiguity, by the way, as you go across all the models, contiguity is always a important, explanatory. It's always a significant variable. Alliance here, still there, actually a little stronger. Cap ratio disappears, interestingly enough. What do I mean by disappear? The asterisks disappear, meaning it's no longer significant. Democracy, yep, significant. And now, by the way, when we've added in these other things, we do find that dependency as they have more trade, the likelihood of war goes down, and that is now significant, albeit at a very weak level. But it's in the predicted direction, right? We predict that higher levels of trade between nations, so higher interdependence between nations, will make them less likely to go to war, or more precisely, have a militarized dispute. So I hope you caught, as I go through, I'm kind of doing this kind of naturally, but as I go from column to column, you see how we say, how are things changing? And I buried the lead. Hey, look at the top. Uh, when we put all these liberal and realist variables in, Huntington's the coefficient for split gets as big as it is, but it's still not significant. And it's negative. It's in the other direction. So and that's always a thing that you report is, hey, it's not significant, but it's not even in the predicted direction. That's kind of the worst result you can get for testing a theoretical hypothesis. So that's what's going on here. Now, they do other tests, and look, we're already at 21 minutes here, but they look at other things that Huntington talked about, and they use the same data, but they just, code things differently. They create some new variables, or they compare cases against each other to see if there's patterns. They test to see, hey, when there's a core nation in a civilization, does that, moderate the behavior? And they generally find that none of this stuff has an impact. But that's what, there's a lot more paper to read. Can't go into all of it, or I cut myself off, or we'll be here all day. Okay. Huntington's reply. I gave you Huntington's reply because that's fair. He replied to them, and that's to show you that we do have a back and forth in the discipline. Huntington is going to bring up, he's going to say, hey, 90% of your stuff is from the Cold War. And well, yeah, because that's the data you have. And it cut off, even though they're writing 2000, the data cut off for them in 92. He says, hey, you're only looking at interstate war. There's other types of violence. True, big point, other types of violence. But you did say that war would be one of them. And so the fact that war isn't occurring, that gives us makes us question these other things. Clearly, terrorism is something that Huntington talks about, and we're unable to deal with it here. And don't look for other people to have done it, because I'll just tell you this. Before 2001, before September 11th attacks, there were no databases of terrorism, domestic terrorism around the world. The only databases were international terrorism, when you crossed a border. And after 2001, every instance of terrorism became interesting. And so the data set changed, and we have a new data set, a new definition, and the data just doesn't honestly exist. If you say, is there more terrorism in the world today, but after 9/11, we don't know, because we don't have the data from before, and because we only tracked when you went across a border, when it was an international event. And increasingly, people are uh, you know today tracking, whenever the Islamic State or Al Qaeda attacks something in a nation, like in Iraq or Syria, those are counted, right? And so we just didn't care about domestic terrorism. And so so there's a big methodological problem in the discipline there. So those are Huntington's replies, and you can read that and take it, on board as you wish. Okay, the last thing here, I have the Chiosa paper. Now, that paper has 5 more years of data in it, right? So that's good. And basically, a lot of the same results come out. It's definitely more dense. Chiosa tests a lot more hypotheses, 10 separate hypotheses, and you'll see the format in there, right? H1, H2, H3. I don't know that it's very precise, but I don't know that it communicates as well or reads as well as the Russett, Oneal, and Cox paper. But it does go into more depth, tests against a broader post-war They have 8 years of post-Cold War data, and there's no, and so he's able to address one of Huntington's criticisms. Hey, your stuff's from the Cold War. It's like, well, we got more stuff from after the Cold War, and when we look at that, we don't see a difference. Right? We don't see that your idea works any better after the Cold War. So that was one thing that's in there. Another thing, though, the one thing that Chiozza finds is that when considering the effect of democracy, he finds an interactive effect, and it's not the effect predicted by Huntington, but he finds that when that democracy has a different impact on the probability of war in dyads from the same civilization as opposed to dyads from different civilizations. And there is a chart, kind of a table like the one I showed you that had the regression results. And again, logistic regression results are difficult to directly interpret, but with a little math, you can turn them into predictions of, hey, what's the probability of a conflict emerging, war, militarized dispute, whatever, how it's defined. And he finds that, and he gives you a figure that shows you the actual probabilities. And it's like, oh, thank God for doing that, right? Thank you for doing the math. And this is something that is not done enough, but it's really cool when they do it. And what we see is, as we go with the regime type, as we go from 0 being non-democratic to being more democratic, we see that for same civilization dyads, there's a big diminution. I mean, we never have more than a 4% chance of conflict because, again, Peru and Zimbabwe don't fight. Okay, but as a proportion, we see that, hey, the amongst same civilization dyads, we as they get more, as the dyad gets more and more democratic, right? That's regime type on the x-axis. The probability of a conflict occurring drops from a little under 4% to less than 1%. And that's what we think happens with democracy. That's what we expect. But amongst different civilization dyads, it's kind of flatline, a little under 2%. It doesn't change a lot. It's significant. I believe that when you look at the coefficients, but when you eyeball it and see the actual change in probability, we see a difference. So there is something going on. It's not necessarily what Huntington predicted, but there's something there. And that's always cool when you can you go into a theory and you do some work and you come out with something. You come out, hey, looking at civilization does give us this thing that democracy, it being from different civilizations, appears to interact with democracy and kind of blunt the effect of differences in democracy. And we can do a lot with that. You can interpret, you can make inferences, and that's something that probably people should be thinking about more. But that's what that chart tells you. So that's all I'm going to go. Chiozza, if I try to go through each of the hypotheses, it'd be really dense. I understand as you read it, you're going to have trouble with it. Try to get as much as you can out of it and skim over, let it wash over you. But hopefully you'll go into the section where they talk about this figure, read that a little more, because that's interesting. The key thing, though, like I say, is here's what happens when we test. Here's when we try to get all the cases, and we're not just focusing on examples that catch the eye or come to mind, and we operationalize things. No, we're not testing the idea of terrorism here. There are parts of Huntington's stuff that aren't addressed by this. However, we tend to, when we find that a lot of predictions aren't, being supported, a lot of the hypotheses aren't being supported, we lose a lot of interest. And in fact, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations is generally amongst IR scholars kind of not, we don't think much of it. I mean, it's there, and we think we think civilizations are important, but we don't think Huntington got it right. And so we have more or less rejected Huntington's theory, although the idea of a clash of civilizations is still out there, and people still examine it and use the title, but the actual predictions of the theory don't seem to really hold as much water.